Howdy and good afternoon. Michael here again. And today I'm going to go off the cuff, just talking about my own personal photography story. I imagine there must be one or two people out there on the interwebs who enjoy hearing these kind of things, and some people might find my tale relatable. And if not, that's okay too. If I pause in between sentences, please don't mind. I'm just trying to go with my train of thought. First, if you don't like my voice, that's fine. If you don't like that I talk with a lisp, that's fine too. I've been living with it all my life. If you don't like wrinkles on my face, guess what? I'm old. Pretty old, probably, compared to most YouTubers. No offense. I was born in 1968, which makes me a proud member of the Generation X community, not the boomer, which we are often accused of being. There is a distinct difference between Gen Xers and boomers, which seems to elude some misinformed millennials and certainly Gen Zers out here on the internet. And no offense, I won't take offense to that, but if you are a Gen Zer or a older millennial, probably I'm the type of guy I would dig your mom. Just saying. My love of photography started at a very young age, probably preteen. I remember my father had one of those little pocketable 110 cameras. If I could find a picture of it, I'll jam it in here somewhere for you to see. And I remember him telling me later on in life, long before he passed, that I used to pick it up and go around and click it just to hear the click and see the flash on it fire, even though there was never any film in the camera at the time. If I remember correctly, he told me at some point in time that I ended up breaking it. At which point in time, they was certainly preteen, because now I remember they got me one of those little Fisher-Price toy cameras so I wouldn't break the next camera that he purchased. Fast forward 1981, I'm 13 years old, and my parents took me to B&H Photo in New York City to get my first SLR. I am a New York native. I do not live in New York anymore. It was an amazing experience, for lack of a better word. Even back then, and I've been to their store, I go to their store frequently as I still travel to New York quite often. But it was an amazing experience seeing all the cameras, all the SLRs they had on the shelves. The Canon AE1 program was the camera they could afford at the time, and for me, it was more than enough. I fell in love with that little camera. I don't have that AE1 program anymore, but I do have a replacement for it. That one fell by the wayside long ago. I would photograph just about anything I could see through the viewfinder. It didn't matter what it was. I would purchase film with my allowance. This is back when film costed probably $2.50 a roll. Maybe I could afford to get 2 or 3 rolls a week. I would somehow coerce my parents into paying for the development of the film. And I also had a paper route at the time. People today might not understand what that is, but that's beyond the scope of this video. And I would use that money too in order to pay for the development of my very crappy pictures. And I used that camera for several years. I don't believe I got my second camera until I was 16 and had, I guess, what we could call a first real working job. Paper route certainly was not that. That second camera I purchased was the Canon A1, and that would have been probably in '84. I worked during summer vacation from school as a foot messenger in New York City. Took the train there at 16 years old, all by my lonesome from Long Island. And my AE1 still worked at the time, but it was great. I had two cameras, both took the same lenses. I didn't have very many lenses. When the AE1 came my way for my birthday, it had a 50 millimeter Canon 1.8 Nifty 50 on it, and that is what I used. Eventually, I did get a second lens. It was a really, really inexpensive Vivitar zoom lens, probably 70 to 200, best guess. Got it at a local store. It probably cost less than $100. I can't remember. Had a Sunpack flash too. It was great to pop that flash on there and go out taking flash pictures as well. With the A1, what I did is whenever I had the free time, I had the money too, I would take the train back out to the city, even though I was working as a foot messenger in the city, just to go around the streets of Manhattan taking pictures of what I could. Growing up when I did, 80s, Gen X, latchkey kids was very much a thing. Parents didn't necessarily always know where their children were, and sometimes they didn't care, and I could disappear for 12 hours at a time, go to the city, spend the day there. Sometimes I'd trick a friend into going and take pictures. Empire State Building, the World Trade Center when it stood, the observation deck of the World Trade Center, observation deck of the Empire State Building, and I love getting up there and shooting the images. Taking the tram to Roosevelt Island and shooting pictures, and it was just a lot of fun. In school, I became known as the kid who walked around with the camera, because there was no other. Even though I had friends who got SLRs after I did, I think maybe they caught the photography bug. They didn't carry their cameras to school. Eventually, I started taking pictures for sports games at the school. They weren't very great, but it was better than anything anyone else had. And for that reason, the paper would approach me and ask if I would give them copies of my negatives or prints from the negatives, which I happily did. After working in the having that job, I eventually became a floor sweeper at a used camera store / film developing lab / photo studio in town. It was called Long Beach Photo. Great guy named Abe and Avi ran it. They were fantastic photographers, Abe better than Avi, and I learned a lot from them. Instead of working for cash, I worked for film, developing, and sometimes a little bonus. That bonus would sometimes include things like an education on photography, for which I am very grateful. They certainly taught me a lot of the aspects of composition of photography, and that helped me improve my craft along the way. And it was just a great experience, because eventually they moved me behind the counter, which was a step up from the floor sweep, and it was great. I remember one holiday weekend night, they took me out to photograph the holiday lights, the Christmas lights in the district in Brooklyn that puts them all up. And for the life of me, the name of it escapes me now, but you can look that up on YouTube, and they've always had the great lights. And my pictures turned out terrible. Abe's were fantastic, Avi's were so, but better than mine. At the time, Abe, he didn't help. I mean, he let me shoot my own images and said, do your best and we'll talk about the results later. And like I said, my results were crap, but he schooled me, and the next time we went out, my images were at least 10% better. As an aside, keep in mind, young photographers or aspiring photographers, when you're online and you see YouTubers or Instagram photographers' images, and you're floored, awestruck by the quality of their images, keep in mind that people only post their best work on the internet. You're seeing the less than 1%. I don't care if a person has been in the game a month, a year, 50 years. They still take trash photos, but they're not going to tell you they take trash photos, and they're not going to show those trash photos. Often because they're trying to sell you a course or sell you presets or push you to purchase an item. Let's take away that aside right now. I eventually did manage to get some additional equipment, and also the great thing was eventually, unfortunately, they had to close down. They simply were not doing enough business, and they couldn't compete with the 1 hour photos that had popped up like Tic Tac boxes all over the place. And before they closed down, Abe gave me what I could call a gift, and it was a gift. In fact, I have that gift right here. Hasselblad 500 cm medium format with 80mm lens attached to it. And this baby still works. I don't put nearly as much film in this as I used to. It's more a conversation piece now than a working photographer's camera, but every so often I will still load this up and take pictures. I never expanded on this system because, frankly, Hasselblad lenses, the lenses are incredibly expensive and have always been beyond my budget, or at least what I was willing to spend on a lens, since I do not consider myself a professional by any stretch of the imagination, just a lifelong enthusiast who has sometimes earned money on the side through photography. But my thanks to them. Shortly, of course, in the late 80s, what happened is Canon pulled what many photographers consider to be I'm going to pause this now. I have to use the restroom, but I'll be back. So sometime in the mid to late 80s, Canon developed the T series camera, the T50, T70, T80 odd camera with a very, very early generation rudimentary autofocus system, and then later the T90. I'll get back to the T90 in a second. I did not buy into the T cameras because I had a friend who had purchased the T50, and he had let me try it, and I just didn't feel comfortable with it. It seemed foreign to me compared to the Canon cameras I had been using, so I decided not to purchase a T-series camera. However, at the time, my original Canon AE1 had been carelessly dropped a few times and was nearing, I knew, what would be the end of its lifespan. And I wanted another camera because I just didn't want to have the A1. I always felt, even though I didn't technically need two bodies, I liked having two bodies, and we'll talk about likes too. So instead of moving to the T system, which in retrospect I'm glad that I did not, I purchased a used Canon F1, which was Canon's top of the line SLR used by photojournalists worldwide. That and the Nikon F3, which I also now own. The reason I'm glad I never did switch to the T system is because Canon would release what was the T90, which, although I never used it, from what I've read, was a fantastic EF mount camera, manual focus. Then, shortly afterward, they pulled what many photographers consider to be a bait and switch. They abandoned the EF mount lens. I'm sorry, let me take that back. They abandoned the FD mount lens and switched to the Canon EOS system, which still the EF mount, which survived until just the last year or two when I moved to the RF mount. So a lot of photographers in that era, they were disheartened by Canon. They felt abandoned because Canon had given no prior announcement. One day, cameras had the EF mount, FD mount lens, and then came along the EF mount lens. So they felt that they had just purchased these spanking brand new Canon T90 cameras, and all of a sudden they would have to upgrade to the EOS. And the two cameras Canon released at about that time were the EOS 650 and the slightly technologically superior 620. Initially, I was reluctant. I considered myself to be an FD mount purist at the time, and I did not want to have to purchase a new camera with a new lens mount system. Well, guess what? Eventually, I did. Now, there was no internet back in those days. It wasn't like you could just place an ad online to try to sell your used gear and use that money to purchase a new camera. Nothing like that exists, and it doesn't matter because I probably wouldn't have, because I have an unhealthy attachment to cameras that seems to preclude my ability to sell used gear rather than let it sit around in plastic bins or on shelves. But ultimately, I did cave. I did purchase the EOS 650. And actually, I did sell the 650 and upgrade it to the 620 not long afterward. And I was sold on the autofocus system. Well, once I had the camera autofocusing for me, I couldn't imagine how I got along without autofocus. It took one step out of the photography process, good or bad. I thought it good at the time. Today, again, in retrospect, I'm not so sure, because I believe that we have let automation replace a lot of the tasks that we did manually. And I don't know if that's for the better or worse, because more and more we have become dependent on the technology. And so 620 was my camera, and time would progress, and I would use additional cameras. I would have the Elon 7E. I probably had a host of other film cameras in between there. After high school, I never had a formal photography education. I went into school for a different degree, thank goodness, because I didn't have the hustle needed to be a professional photographer. And I really didn't, I'll tell why in a second, but I really didn't want that to be my life path. I was an enthusiast, a hobbyist, an amateur, but I certainly never had the drive to be a professional photographer. So I can't remember how I made his acquaintance, but I became acquainted with a wedding photographer in the area, and he allowed me to intern with him. Essentially, I did not do second shooting at first. At first, I was merely a changed film guy. He had two medium format bodies. I would be holding one of them. He would pass me one. I would change the film, hand him the loaded camera when he was ready for it, and I would sometimes adjust lighting outside, and that was my job. And it actually paid pretty well as a weekend gig, because most weddings were done on weekends and very seasonal, but it was great. And he taught me a lot. I learned how to do wedding photography. After a year, I went out and I did do wedding photography on my own. Did about 20. And I never had clients complain about my image quality or the pictures I took. But one thing I understood is that, and I'm sure wedding photographers out there will agree with me, is that the cadence of a wedding is very hard to keep up with. You as a photographer have to learn where to position yourself in advance for specific shots. You have to learn who at that wedding you have to devote most of your attention to, take the most pictures of. You have to deal with situations like a venue not allowing artificial lighting, understandable. How to deal with a bride in a white gown and a groom in a jet black tuxedo with inclement weather outdoors, and And the biggest thing is the hustle of getting new clients. Again, we're talking about an era. Well, at this time, the internet did exist in a more fledgling state. But back then, the way that we got clients as a photographer is they would have bridal conventions at venues in whatever city you have to live in. You would rent a booth. You would have your photos laid out in the booth, your business card, and you would have to sell yourself to the brides and the grooms who would come to the booths, looking for the wedding photographer, their wedding photographer. And it was a lot of hustle and bustle and a lot of hustle. And I do not consider myself the best orator in the world. I'm probably a better photographer and a much more fluent writer than I am an orator. And I am also very much an introvert. So that dampens one's ability to secure clients. And I realized within those 6 months that wedding photography was not for me. But I did not let that dissuade me from my enjoyment of taking pictures. As I aged and had a job, I came to have what we can call a disposable income. And I developed what a lot of photographers do, which is called gear acquisition syndrome. Basically, the unnecessary acquisition or purchase of gear that we don't really need, often by convincing ourselves that with a new lens, with a new camera body, with a new speed light, our photos are somehow going to be magically better than they were in the past. And what happens too is that one purchase leads to another. And what was merely a little bit of disposable income quickly becomes credit card debt. One camera becomes two cameras become four cameras become eight becomes 16, and so on. And I know I am not speaking for myself because I am a frequent peruser of Reddit forums and the like, and I see people discussing gas like I'm talking about now every day of the week. And we've all fallen victim to it. Now, I believe I've conquered mine. I have not made a significant purchase, and by significant purchase, I mean anything over, any individual item over $150 in the last couple of years. And I have no need to because I have more cameras right now. But the cameras I have will outlive me, and they'll probably be passed down to my nephews, hopefully, or somebody that has an interest in photography after I have become food for worms, as we all will. But still, it's an issue, and I don't want to see young people fall into debt. So when I talk about I have this camera or that camera, I'm not trying to brag, haha, I have more cameras than you. I don't want to see young people fall into debt for gear that you don't need. No, if you're independently wealthy, or if you are one of those rare seven-figure photographers, and don't believe everybody who claims that they are. They are extremely rare. I know one of them, probably the most famous wedding photographer in Calabasas, California, one of the most expensive zip codes in the nation. And this guy, he still today in 2024 is shooting with a pair of Nikon D3s, even though he could afford to purchase whichever Nikon is the latest out there, the Z whatever. If you're getting into photography, it's best to spend the least amount of money possible until you're sure photography is going to be your profession or a hobby that you pursue before dumping tons of money, because photography is an expensive hobby. Even if you're shooting film, film is expensive. It's an expensive hobby. But I continued, and I had an on and off. I had an on and off love affair with photography. I'm sorry about that. From that point forward, there were times I would go into ruts, especially when I wasn't traveling someplace, because I felt as though I had photographed everything native to me, local to me. If you live in a city for several years and you photograph just about every fire hydrant and stop sign and street light and building front at every corner, if you're not on the road, you feel, what is there to photograph? And again, I see this discussed ad nauseum on the forums. And I'm trying to break that rut, because what's the point of having so many cameras? I'm going to pause this one more time. What's the point of having so many cameras if you're not going to go out and shoot? But I digress. Like I said, this is all stream of thought narration. 2000 comes around, and guess what? We're hitting the digital revolution, baby. Analog is fast becoming a thing of the past. I had just purchased, at that point in time, the Canon EOS 1V. Mine still works. Canon's last professional grade DSLR. And this old cheap crappy 85mm on it that doesn't work anymore. So I use it as a lens cap, a body cap, because I can't seem to find the body cap for it. And I continued shooting film at that time, still using my manual focus and my autofocus cameras. And I used this, I guess, up until about 2003. I was still shooting with this camera regularly. By that time, everybody was talking digital. Advertisers, the slick magazines, were still shooting analog, of course. Newspapers had absolutely switched to digital by that time. And I was very resistant to change. I said to myself, there is no way I'm going to give up film for digital photography. And maybe if you were around back then, you felt the same way. You loved your cameras. You had become acquainted with your cameras. You've learned how to use your cameras. You had attachment to your cameras. And the thought of switching to this new digital system where your images were recorded on a sensor instead of film seemed very foreign to you, as it did to me. And it was around that time too that I did end up purchasing. It was in 2003 that I did end up purchasing my first digital SLR. This piece of plastic, the Canon Digital Rebel, also known as the Canon EOS 300D. I don't know how much money it cost Canon to produce these models. They're incredibly flimsy. I'm just fortunate that I never dropped this one, and therefore it still works with some quirks. And I was immediately disappointed. Not necessarily with the image quality. For the 6 megapixel sensor, if I'm correct, which this has, I was quite pleased with the picture quality that came out of it. But what I had a hard time getting used to was that this camera has a very small, dark viewfinder, and I was used to using the incredibly bright and large viewfinder on the Canon EOS 1V. If this was day, this was night. And I shelved this camera at the time and went back to using film. somebody, I can't remember when it came out, but eventually that problem was remedied when I got my hands on the Canon 5D shortly after it came out. Incredibly expensive at the time. I think it was $3,000, and it put me in debt. It certainly did. But I loved using this camera. My FD cameras, my FD mount cameras at the time, they got shelved. They got put in boxes and went into storage. I kept the EOS 1V out because I still wanted to shoot some film. But at that point in time, I had largely migrated to digital, was learning how to use products like Photoshop and Lightroom to enhance the images. But it was clear that the march toward digital cameras was here, and nothing was going to stop that, the digital revolution from hitting hard. Went out shooting, again, shooting all over, whatever I could. It was magical. We had the camera. All you had to do was have a compact flash card for the camera, and you could take a zillion pictures. No cost of developing film. Once you had the camera, once you had the lenses, once you had the compact flash card, that was your expense. No more spending money on individual rolls of film. No more waiting for processing, waiting to see what the images turned out, because even though the viewfinders on these cameras pale in comparison to what we have today, and especially with the chimp screen or the view screen on back. There I go again, old age. It was a huge time saver. And for all the work people in the industry that I knew that were actually beginning to earn a living from photography, they were like kids on Christmas Day with the amount of time they saved and the amount of money they saved going to digital. Again, time flies by. I continue to buy cameras, sometimes putting myself in hefty debt for them. For example, I'm not a video guy, as you can tell by the quality of this video, but I'm recording this on an older Canon EOS C100 Mark II, which is a dedicated video camera, and I don't use it for anything but shooting video of my cats. Shows you how easy it is to waste money on this hobby. And yes, sometimes we like to call it investment, but if you are not earning back the money you spent on gear, let's call a spade a spade, it can be considered a waste of money. But would I do it again if I have to? No, probably not. I'd probably try and be a little more frugal about the gear rather than incur countless amounts of debt on gear. I would go on to purchase the Canon 5D Mark II. Guess what? Fell off a cliff. Skipped the 5D3, got the 5D4. Would later purchase the Canon 6D2 as a companion camera, backup camera to it. That 6D2, which I have, and which I've owned since shortly after it came out probably, has less than 1,000 shutter actuations on it, sitting around. This case holds a Sigma 150-6 lens. I think this lens has come out of this case exactly 4 times since I purchased the lens. Look, I'm not trying to make this a video about regrets, because I do actually love photography. And I'm trying to satisfy a bucket list. One of my bucket lists is to visit all 50 states, take pictures in all 50 states, and then start trying to make my way overseas. And I had a great time during the pandemic while everyone was sitting at home locked in their houses. I was flying around the country on cheap airfare, getting cheap hotel rooms. Yeah, a lot of things were closed down. Guess what? I was able to walk into national parks, see nobody there. Sure, the gates were closed. That didn't stop me. There was no one to stop me from entering the parks. And I walked around and I took pictures and I had a great time. And there was something refreshing about being out there alone, sans the crowds, in fair weather, and being able to enjoy myself. And it was great. Again, I digress. As we know, several years ago, mirrorless replaced DSLR. And nowadays, everybody is talking about how the DSLR is a dead dinosaur. Dump that crap. Get yourself a mirrorless. And I'm not a mirrorless hater. I own 3 mirrorless bodies. I own the Canon R6. I own the Fujifilm X-T3. And I have a Sony A6400. So I'm no brand loyalist, even though the majority of my money, as I've said, is in the Canon ecosystem. Again, a lot of these were gas purchases, whimsical purchases that I didn't need. And so I just have the body and the one lens for each of those cameras, and that's it. And mirrorless, look, there are some great things about mirrorless cameras. One, the weight. I'm getting older. I'll be 66. 56. Damn, don't let me do that to myself. 56 in March. Things get heavier, especially if you're toting them around for a long time. And I know, even though I don't own RF lenses, I know it's a lot easier on a person to tote around RF lenses than it is the older EF mount lenses. And I know that the mirrorless bodies, even with a battery grip attached, are lighter than my Canon 5D4 or my Canon 1DX. That thing is a beast. But on the other side, that beast now has over 1 million actuations on it. And I'm anxious to see whether my R6, I don't expect the R6 to survive, but I'd be eager to see if anybody's Canon R5s or R3s last for 1 million shutter actuations. Like I said, I'm not purchasing any more cameras, and I'll die on that hill. Although I have nothing against mirrorless, and I do admit they have benefits over DSLRs, weight, like I said, and invariably autofocus. The autofocus on DSLRs is light years behind the autofocus systems on even entry-level mirrorless cameras. Battery life on mirrorless cameras, however, is not so great because so many things are being powered at one point in time. I still prefer optical viewfinders over electronic viewfinders. For one reason, I find EVFs tend to give me a lot of eye strain, and I still prefer to see the world naturally, not a digital representation of it as I am taking the picture, even though I know once that image is exported onto a computer, that I'll be looking at a digital representation anyway. I still enjoy taking pictures and printing pictures. I'm not, like I said, I'm not a great photographer. I consider myself an adequate photographer who sometimes takes good pictures. Wherever I happen to be. I even shoot Polaroids. I have 3 instant film cameras, including an old Polaroid SX70. And again, I'm pausing because I'm reaching for thought in some hidden cul-de-sac of my conscious mind. And I think I've rambled on long enough for this video. I've been in a rut, photography-wise. I haven't been out to take pictures in a couple months now. The last time I took any serious pictures was when I traveled back to New York City in September. So October, November, December, January. It's been 4 months since I really tried to get any creative juices flowing, and I'm trying to break that rut. I live in a place called Irving, Texas. Very boring. I don't like to drive very much. When I travel, I usually travel by public transportation. It gives me more enjoyment to view my surroundings rather than have to view a foreign road I'm not accustomed to. But I'm doing what I can to break that rut. I've recently gotten some fresh film. I'm hoping to get out, even though it's been cold outside lately, and take some pictures. I know this has been a mishmash. I've probably forgotten to iterate on the things I wanted to talk about. I don't want to waste your time too much. I just thought I would share a few thoughts of mine. And I hope you enjoy photography as much as I do. But keep in mind, young photographer, an expensive camera does not equal amazing pictures. If you cannot take a great picture with a $500 camera, you will not take a great picture with a $5,000 camera. And just, when we talk about something like the original Canon 5D, there are a lot of people out there who prefer the aesthetic of those images, of the old CCD sensors, over what we have today. Cameras that aren't burdened by cumbersome menus that require an engineering degree to decipher, filled or replete with functions that 99.9% of users will never look at. Cameras with 500-page manuals that you have to read with a magnifying glass, and even after that, you're turning to YouTube to try to understand what was said in the manual. Hey, I hope everybody out there has a great photographic journey, whether you're a hobbyist like me or you're a working pro. We're all here for the same reason. We do love photography. Mike out for now. Cheers.